As chaos and destruction rained down upon the surface of Terraria, people fled in all directions only to be hunted down and killed. Others hid but were inevitably captured to work as slaves for an inconceivable master. Some, though, managed to avoid the gaze of their would-be overlords, finding refuge in the dark caverns underground, but digging too deep in search of materials to sustain their people. The survivors of the overworld's corrupt cataclysm would inadvertently release a bane that had been trapped in darkness for millennia, festering in its own rage. The only hope to stem this vengeance-fueled torrent would lay with a single survivor who had gone through their own torturous imprisonment, one who would unite the scattered, broken remnants of the cavern builders and lead them in a resistance to stem the tide of retribution, preserving the underground and overworld alike. Far back in Terraria's turbulent past, before the civil war that would leave them an isolated shadow of their former selves, the lizards built great and wondrous cities across the surface world that gleamed in the light of the sun. While some buildings were constructed from more regular materials, the more spectacular ones were crafted from shining, polished marble, a testament to the advanced and perceived superiority of lizard culture. Such exquisite architecture was afforded only by extensive mining operations that reached deep into Terraria's bowels, seeking out and extracting the valuable materials however it was possible. It is no surprise that the rock face at which the lizard workers toiled was a far cry from the wondrous urban vistas above, but the true extent of the disparity between the two would have been enough to appall and sicken anyone unfortunate enough to learn of it. For that very reason, details of exactly how the marble had been extracted was kept strictly out of the public eye, with the ruling class preferring to perpetuate the belief that how it was sourced was not so important as how it was used, and so the injustice went on, the poorest members of society having no choice but to join the mining guilds if they had any hope of affording their next meal. Unbeknown to them though, as soon as they descended into the depths, the likelihood of them ever emerging again was almost non-existent. They would be led to the marble seam, where demand for the luxury resource forced workers to spend whole days and nights chipping away at the rock. If they were lucky, they may manage to sleep for a few hours at a time, but more often than not, the workers simply collapsed from exhaustion, a pickaxe still in their hand. For the longest time it had been suspected that the widespread poverty among the lower class was by design, that the ruling elite artificially tampered with wages and taxes, so that when there was a shortage of workers, a recession suddenly occurred that left the poorest members of society no choice but to join the miners. Despite the attempts at censorship, the conditions in the mines had become a thing of rumour among the labourers, a sort of horror story that kept the workforce in line to an extent. Even these nightmare tales did not accurately portray the real state of things below their very feet, however, for something much, much worse was going on, something not even the ruling class were fully aware of. For years the miners had struggled to cut away at the solid marble, their tools inadequate to mine sandstone, let alone anything else, and their superiors unwilling to go to the expense of providing anything better. Other techniques were explored in an effort to make the process more efficient. First it was explosives, but the resultant products were deemed to be too damaged for construction purposes. Little did it seem to matter that the detonations were carried out with no forewarning, leading to dozens of immediate deaths, only to be followed by hundreds more when the blasts inevitably caused widespread cave-ins. Automation was considered for a time, much to the surprise and relief of many a worker, but it was soon classified as an equally frivolous use of funds as it was to upgrade the mining tools, and so the backbreaking task of chipping massive slabs from the living earth and hauling them to the surface remained a job carried out by hand. The final idea was the strategic use of chemicals to weaken the marble in certain places, so that usable chunks practically fell away from the rock face. Concerns had been raised about the susceptibility of the marble to acids and the risks of impairing the integrity of entire seams, but a concoction was developed that was assured to do exactly what was needed without damaging the product. This, it seemed, was the perfect answer. After limited testing, it was found that the unique blend of chemicals performed as promised, and more importantly, were cheap, so were rushed into use in the mines. For a while it seemed that a permanent solution had been found. Productivity was up, and even the miners were pleased, as this new substance substantially reduced their workload. Conditions would quickly take a turn for the worse though, as the chemical mixture had never been tested for its impact on living creatures. Yet another oversight in the name of cost savings. Gradually workers using the substance at the rock face began to fall ill, their skin growing almost stone-like, and within days they were met with death as they were suffocated by the carapace growing across them. Obviously some sort of reaction had occurred between the chemicals and the marble, marble, the deadly vapor it produced then breathed in by the miners. But strangely enough, it was only the male workers who were meeting this particular fate, as the women among them began to undergo a form of mutation. In the early stages, the coloration of their skin would fade, and their tails would begin to atrophy. Next, their cranial ridges began to elongate, becoming a mass of fleshy tentacles, until the point where their tails had completely withered and would be shed away. The last apparent stage of the metamorphosis was when the tentacles went on to develop mouths of their own, taking on the appearance of a writhing nest of snakes. Fearing the spread of the abominable creatures, anyone who displayed a possibility of turning was spirited away and chained up in specially constructed dwellings carved from the marble seam itself. The decision, it transpired, may have been prudent, as the changed workers became aggressive and seemed to develop a unique ability. Whereas the male victims had been effectively turned to stone, those transformed were able to rapidly inflict the same condition on others by merely looking at them. Even with this epidemic rapidly spreading and the workforce dwindling, the mines remained open, the greed of the ruling class outweighing the importance of people's lives. But soon enough they were left without a choice, as the amount of these aberrations swelled to unmanageable numbers, and they inevitably broke free of their bondage, wreaking havoc across the mines and turning all they gazed upon to stone. Rather than attempt an evacuation, the ruling class decided it would be best to collapse the mines, leaving everything down there, including the majority of their workers, to their fates. Although torturous, death would be relatively swift for the workers, but for the transformed creatures, fate would be rather crueler. Their condition had not only caused them horrifying mutations, but also unnaturally long life. For thousands of years they would reside, trapped in the darkness, alone. The few surviving miners that had made it back to the surface took with them tales of snake-haired monsters and their friends turning to stone before their eyes. While the stories were not widely believed, a result of yet more societal censorship, they did endure, becoming myths and legends that told of the great and terrifying Medusas. In ancient times, when calamity fell from the sky and scorched the ground in the fires of corruption, the people of Terraria reacted in very different ways. There were those who welcomed the strange cosmic visitor, even bowing before it as a divine lord, and were rewarded for their trust with enslavement. There were others who fought the bizarre creature from beyond the stars, only to be cut down as though their opposition was nothing. Most people ran, however, fleeing in whatever way they could, but little by little, the corruption's tainted touch caught up with them, sentencing them to the same fate as everyone else. But then there was another group, a collection of people who neither submitted nor ran, but instead hid. While many shelters were uncovered and summarily destroyed, some fugitives followed cave systems deep into the ground, finding themselves in large caverns carved out over eons by the never-ending trickle of water through the crags in the earth. After days of descending through caves and narrow tunnels without any sustenance, the refugees of Terraria's cataclysm would turn to anything that would keep them alive. They ate strange mushrooms and repulsive creatures that resided in the rock face, drinking the trickle of foul fluids that seeped from the walls. It was almost a miracle then, when a pool of seemingly fresh water was uncovered, enough to sustain all of the survivors indefinitely. This, it was decided, was where they would build their new lives, and all would quickly partake of the water, including a young man, unremarkable in the throngs of filthy and battered survivors. But like the others, he would feel rejuvenated and invigorated by the water, almost like it was giving back to him the life the arduous flight from the surface had taken. An adventurous soul, this young man chose to join the Explorers, a group who would traverse the depths, scouring every cave for anything useful that could be returned home. Their task was dangerous though, more dangerous even than travelling to the surface. At least up there the threats were known, but underground everything was new, and every cavern may contain something deadly, where a single misplaced footstep could be lethal. This would be something the brave explorer would soon come to experience firsthand, for it was not ambition or hubris that would drive his terrible fate, but one simple but ultimately fatal mistake. Setting out with his companions from the relative safety of the campsite, the expedition began the same as any other. They started by finding a wide enough crag to follow into the living earth, inevitably emerging into a cavern of some kind. Here they may find useful resources or valuable trinkets, but more often than not, all they discovered were dank hollows containing only darkness. Despite the semblance to every other excursion, the explorers knew the risks and were careful to avoid them. But on this day, all the caution in the world would do nothing to stem the fate that awaited them. Having completed their expedition, the explorers headed back to camp, once more empty-handed, while trying to retrace their steps to avoid unknown ground. On occasions they had gotten lost, or been forced to take an alternate route, but each time they had managed to make it back without incident. This time, it seemed, their luck had finally run out, as a cave-in had blocked their only way back. There was no option but to continue forward, past where they had explored, and into brand new territory. Although a setback, this was nothing the explorers weren't prepared to deal with. They had provisions for days, and the skill to seek out more if they needed, but time was still against them, for the oppressing darkness and solitude of the caverns was enough to incite madness in even the most stoic of souls. After camping at the edge of known territory, the explorers pushed ever further through the twisting labyrinth of caves and tunnels, each looking as identical as the last, but it was to no avail. For days they travelled, dodging the dangers of the subterranean world, growing ever wearier until the inevitable happened. While trying to traverse past a recluse nest, that young recruit slipped and fell into the spider's grasp. Immediately they were upon him, biting and tearing at his flesh. His companions knew this would mean certain death, and so, adhering to the agreement they had all taken upon joining the explorers, fled so they too would not become victims. Supposedly the spider venom was fast acting. Death should have been swift, and indeed consciousness drifted quickly away as the creatures began to consume his body. It was to his horror then, when he awoke, to one of the spiders stripping the muscles from his bones. Somehow he had survived, and was continuing to survive, as arteries were severed, and organs were torn out. The pain would have been excruciating, but through either shock or the effect of the venom, there was no pain. Occasionally he fell back into unconsciousness, but when he awoke, parts of his body seemed to have regenerated, so that the spiders may consume them again and again. At first unknown to the fallen explorer, this was the effect of that water he and the rest of the refugees had survived on, granting him seemingly eternal life. The torture continued for weeks, and then months before turning into years. By that point he had lost his mind many times over, becoming a husk, merely existing before abruptly regaining his sanity, only to lose it once more. After endless consumption and regeneration of his flesh, it appeared that his body was finally giving out, as for the most part he was now just tendons and bones. But still he lived. No longer of any value to the spiders, what was left of him was cut loose from the webbing to fall to the detritus of the nest. Here he lay, free of his tormentors, yet too weak, too much of his body missing to make his escape. It was a cruel fate, he considered, to be close to so many freedoms, and yet unable to grasp any of them. He could not move. He could not think properly. He could not even die. At that moment, he could not comprehend, lying in the pit of filth he believed to be his living grave, what he would go on to do, the wondrous and terrible things he would achieve, and the way it would transform the hidden world beneath Terraria. At first they lived from day to day, pitching tents or sleeping on the bare rock, scrounging up any morsels of food they could, while fending off the vicious creatures that lived in the subterranean darkness. In time, the unwitting pioneers would grow familiar with their new surroundings, beginning to see the creatures they lived alongside more of a resource than a threat, and constructing makeshift shelters in the cavern walls. This would not do though. If this was to be their home, then it must feel like it. It was not enough for the survivors to merely go on existing. They had to maintain genuine lives if they were to keep alive the hope that they would one day reclaim the surface. Expeditions travelled to the overworld to find resources and relics of their old lives, so that they might recreate what they had lost in an underground bastion of civilization. Every single one of the survivors knew what they were risking each time they travelled to the surface, and knew all too well how much safer it would have been to just go on hiding in the dark crevices. But then they would have been little better than the animals they lived alongside. At first their follies above ground were simple: get into their old homes, grab as much as they could, and then duck back underground before the roving creatures of corruption found them. The first raids netted the survivors random items of clothing, trinkets, and often rotten foodstuffs, but the more they did, the more focused they became. Soon their planning allowed them to conduct raids more like military operations, knowing exactly where they needed to go, and getting out with everything they needed before anyone knew they were there. Of course there were casualties, mostly the consequence of unforeseen conditions or foolhardy actions. Each time they would learn though, learning the behaviour of the corrupt beings until a bold proposal was made. No longer did the survivors wish to live in caves and hollows, no matter how full of comforts they were. They wished to live in homes once more, and so a project was proposed that would take their most skilled raiders to the surface to retrieve important building materials not found beneath ground, primarily wood. Dismantling the walls of their old homes would take too much effort and deprive them of shelter during raids, so they resorted to chopping down full trees and transporting them beneath the surface. Working in shifts when they would not be noticed, the survivors managed to build a stockpile of wood that they would soon refine and use to construct houses in the caverns they had come to call home. In time, these houses sprang up all through the underground, continually populated with more and more bits and pieces of the old world. The residents would even end up mining the caverns in search of precious metals that they could craft into more extravagant decorations and equipment. They dug down deep through the earth, breaking through veins of solid metal ore, fighting off caverns full of fierce creatures, and fording underground rivers until they encountered a layer of unusually white stone. This would be the natural cover stone to the living tomb of the Medusas. Breaking through the seal as they had with all other barriers they had encountered, the survivors soon found themselves accosted in the darkness. Some were turned to stone immediately by the Medusa's terrible power, but others were taken prisoner, stripped of the loot they had collected, and interrogated as to the state of the lizard civilization. Of course, the reptile race had been lost to history by this point, and the survivors could not answer, only angering their captors further. They were kept imprisoned without sustenance as the Medusas ventured out to explore beyond their marble crypt, having forgotten what food or water were. At last, they would become so comfortable in their new lives that the hope they had fought so hard to cling on to began to fade, and the surface became nothing more than a distant memory. The lives they had built were never destined to last though, for as soon as they had ventured into their new underground world, a curse had befallen them. The water they had been forced to drink to survive in the caverns had been tainted, not by some terrible pathogen, but by a substance of eternal life. The slimes. Creatures literally formed from the blood of godly beings, often swam in the underground pools, the oils from their gelatinous bodies mixing with the water around them. In small doses, the oils were thought to have healing properties, but in the amounts the survivors were inadvertently consuming, it would lead to nigh on immortality. The everlasting life granted to the refugees was different, however. It would allow a person to live indefinitely, but their body would continue to grow old and wither until they were nothing more than animate skeletons. Without knowing what was happening to them, the cavern dwellers were driven to madness and abandoned their homes, turning on one another in the process, attempting to kill friends and family members, but none of it was to any avail. Every time one of their number was broken into parts, after a while they would inevitably reconstitute and go on living, only experiencing the freedom of true death when their bones eventually turned to dust. Time no longer meant anything to the young explorer, and more had passed than he could accurately acknowledge. Slowly though, a form of alertness awoke within his mind, and he began to regain control of his limbs. They had not regenerated like they had before, and yet he was inexplicably able to move them. He had concluded at some point during his captivity that this must be because of the water. He had always thought that rush of life, the rejuvenation he experienced every time he drank, wasn't normal. But how could mere water have that kind of power? His mind still wasn't complete, the years of torture having shattered his sense of reality. Some parts of his mind were still sane, but others had decayed and shriveled, making his thoughts fragmented and his actions erratic. Eventually, he rallied enough of both his physical and mental strength to claw his way out of the nest and back up into the cave network. He held little hope that anyone at the camps could help him, if there indeed were any camps left. But he had nowhere else to go, so continued to drag his broken body through the tunnels, hoping he would stumble across what he had come to call home. Soon he learned how to crawl, and then walk again, bare bones somehow able to sustain his weight. After everything he had been through, the dangers of the cavern that he had once feared no longer meant anything to him, and he strode, unafraid, as the creatures of the dark crevices merely watched him, not knowing what to make of his skeletal figure. After roaming the underground until the cave networks were burned into his memory, he came across not his old camp, but a cabin, now empty and abandoned. Was this the result of the community of survivors? If so, then where were they? He searched the surrounding area, but found nothing of them. However, what he did find would answer questions he had held since being entrapped in that spider nest. He found one of the life-giving pools of water, and in it floated a slime, one of the nuisances they had had to deal with, even on the surface. In his broken mind, an idea formulated. He had heard stories of the primordial slimes, firstborn of the gods themselves. Could it be that the life-giving essence began with them? Before he knew it, he was upon the slime, pulling it from the water and beating it to pieces. Without thinking, he consumed the slime, hoping it would restore his body and mind. As it happened, it would do one, but undo what was left of the other, for his fragmented mind reformed, but the remaining flesh that clung to his body now fell away, leaving only his animate skeleton. So it was true, the slimes did contain the nectar of the gods, the essence diluting into the water, only to be consumed by the survivors. He had already been through too much, so having the rest of his body decay before his eyes was nothing new. For everyone else though, an experience like that may very well break them. They were kept long beyond the time when they should have perished of starvation, and eventually met the same fate as the rest of their brethren. The Medusas were bewildered at their captives becoming insane undead skeletons, but dared not squander an opportunity, for now what was left of their minds was malleable and easily influenced. Could this explain the abandoned housing? Could they have lost their minds and left everything behind? If so, then what was there left for him? But then he realised he was the only one who knew the secret of the slimes. If he could somehow refine and perfect their essence, then he could restore both himself and his people. His materials were limited though. The equipment in the single cabin he had found not enough to conduct his research, so he set off again into the caves to scour the remnants of what his people had become before their downfall. He collected items of all kinds from across the underground, hauling them to where he needed with only a simple sack. While exploring the cabins, he would come across some of the survivors, now reduced to mindless skeletons as he had suspected. Forced to shatter one in an altercation, he would add their bones to his sack, returning them to his lab to experiment on. Occasionally he would be encountered by explorers and survivors from the overworld. At first he was fearful of them, and them of he, for they had evidently encountered some of his manic, hostile brethren, but soon they became aware of his collection of items, and for them they were willing to trade the valuable chemicals and equipment he needed. In time he would gain the reputation of being a merchant of the underground, and would become sought out by more adventurers, who came to call him a variety of names, typically played on his skeletal figure. He cared not though, for finally he was able to begin his research, and after having locked himself away for a long while, experimenting on hundreds of slimes, he managed to distill an oil from them, one he would proceed to test on himself. During his travels through the underground, some of his bones had become damaged, so he took the opportunity to see if the oil would repair them. To his disappointment, it did not. But then something occurred to him. He removed his own damaged bone and, using the slime oil, attempted to replace it with one of the bones from the survivors. To his amazement and horror, it worked. How could he justify using someone else's body parts to sustain himself? But this would be a process he would need to carry out many more times, and each time he would ask himself that question less and less. It was true that the slime oil had not worked as he had intended, but it was a start, something to drive him forward, with hope that he may one day find a way to recover his people and repay what he was taking from them. The Medusas had found no trace of their once kin, but had encountered rumours of an impenetrable structure said to contain lost people from a forgotten time. It would become the Medusas' mandate to move through the underground in force, imposing their will on any they encountered until they learnt the truth of the lizards and extracted their revenge. Their thirst for retribution was never about to end there though, and their crusade would consume all of Terraria's underground, the Medusas' brainwashed captives as its vanguard. Even though their army would be immortal, they were still capable of being damaged, or even destroyed completely if their bones were scattered far enough apart, so this fighting force would need protection like any other. Their pitiful mining equipment from long ago was hardly of any use to mine a reasonable form of ore, and the Medusas soon found that they needed some other way to armour their soldiers. Venturing outside their marble safe havens previously had been a risk, and to do so again without protection would be suicide, so they would devise an innovative way of achieving their goals. They remembered that their captives had brought with them a treasure trove of plundered trinkets, most of them made of gold that the Medusas could melt down and reforge into their first set of armour. It was crude to start with, but later iterations would become resplendent, heralding a force to be reckoned with. Having a successful proof of concept, the Medusas set about capturing the now skeletal cabin builders who ventured too close to their territory, converting them to their cause. Armor materials remained a problem to them though, as these skeletons no longer carried with them the bullion that they had treasured in their past. Well, luckily enough, word would come to them of a cabin builder who had not completely lost his mind after losing his flesh, and now traded with wealthy adventurers from the surface. It was only a matter of time before this skeleton merchant found his way to the Medusas' marble prison, and would be met with an ultimatum: provide the Medusas with gold to be melted down, or watch what was left of his people get wiped out. He would do as they asked, and continue trading with the overworlders, returning gold coins and trinkets he sourced back to the Medusas. But secretly, he was working on his own plan, for after exhaustive research he had found a cure of sorts to the madness that plagued the fallen cabin builders. It would not return their flesh, but it was enough to return a degree of sanity to his peers, enough at least to forge them into his own fighting force. Unrestricted as the Medusas had been, the skeleton merchant set to disseminating his serum among the skeleton population. While some responded well to it, unfortunately many more did not. He would have to refine the cure if he was to save all of his people, but for now there were more pressing concerns, and he had influence over enough to begin forming an army. Using all of his contacts and influence, he managed to procure enough armaments for his entire force. In time, the merchant ceased providing materials to the Medusas, confident that he would be able to face them in battle. But by this point, the Medusas' ranks had too swollen to become a fearsome opponent. Fearful of the threat they posed, the skeleton merchant led his army in a preemptive strike against the Medusas. They easily pushed through the underground to the marble caverns, but met significant resistance when trying to infiltrate them. Legions of both the merchant's armoured skeletons and the Medusas' hoplites fell, only to reconstitute and be felled again. The battle quickly descended into a stalemate, each side equally matched, yet unwilling to fall back. Eventually, seeing that they would not be able to achieve what they had set out to do, the Medusas decided to end the battle by going back into hiding. They would collapse the openings that had been made into their domain, burying themselves and their army until such a time they could emerge again, unhindered in their quest for revenge. No longer required to fight, the skeleton merchant would release his army to pursue their own ends, whilst he returned to trying to perfect his serum, still trading with the overworlders for the materials he needed, the goal of curing his people never wavering in his mind. Those armoured skeletons that now roam the underground would be ready though, if the threat of the Medusas ever emerged again, and in fact some would band together, travelling far and wide in an effort to prepare for the inevitable day when they would once more be called to arms. Hi everyone, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you liked what you saw, then please consider liking the video, subscribing and sharing it with your friends. If you want to support the channel even more, then head over to Patreon, become a channel member or buy some merch. Links are all down in the description. I hope you all have a great day and I'll see you next time.